Good morning, everyone. In the last session, we have seen how to create our first application by using Spring Boot. Spring Boot application we can create in two ways. One is by using initializer website. Second one is by using IDE. Creating project using start.spring.io. Start.spring.io is the official website where we can create our boot application. Second approach, by using IDE also, we can create the project. If you create the project by using IDE, internally it will communicate with the initializer website only. Okay, now, so internet connection is mandatory for your system if you want to create the project by using Spring Boot. Now, so what is the application folder structure? So when we create a Spring Boot application with the project name, a folder will be created. Inside that, main Java, main resources, test Java, then Maven dependencies, target folder, pom.xml file is available. In main Java, one class is getting created by default. This class is called as start class. The start class is the entry point for boot application execution. And the properties file or YML file used for configuration purpose. Application test Java is available, where we are going to write the JUnits required for our application. Maven dependencies. Maven dependencies contains the jars which are downloaded for our project. Target folder, it contains .class files. pom.xml, these are Maven configuration file. This is a Maven configuration file. Now we will write our main Java code under src main Java folder. Configurations we are going to write under resources folder. Unit test code we are going to write inside test Java folder. Dependencies we will configure in the pom.xml. Pom stands for project object model, right? What is start class? So if you see here in our Spring Boot application, start class is available by default. This start class is a very special class in the Spring Boot. We need to understand internals of this start class. Now, when you right click on the project, run as boot application, the Spring Boot application execution will begin from start class only. Inside the start class, we have a main method. Inside the main method, we are calling spring application.run method. And we are having one annotation called Spring Boot application annotation. We are having one annotation called Spring Boot application annotation. Spring Boot application annotation is equal to below three annotations. One is boot configuration. Second one is enable auto configuration. Third one is component scanning. Okay, what is the purpose of these three annotations that we need to understand, right? First, let's understand what is this run method. What is this run method? Spring application dot run method is called as bootstrapping method. Spring application dot run method contains a bootstrapping logic. It is the entry point for boot application execution. Now, what this run method is doing in the Spring Boot? What this run method is doing in the Spring Boot? This run method is very important because lot of logic is available inside this run method. First, it is going to create bootstrap context which is required to run our application. It is going to start initializers. To run our application, some initializers are required. It is going to start the initializers. It is going to start the listeners. It is going to start the listeners. It is going to prepare environment to run our application. Prepare the environment to run our application. Then it is going to print a banner for our application. Creating bootstrap context. So whenever this run method started, it is going to create a bootstrap context. Bootstrap context means it will prepare the memory which is required to load all the predefined classes in the Spring Boot to run our application. Then initializer classes will be loaded. Then listeners will be loaded. Then it is going to prepare the environment to run our application. Then a banner will be printed. After this, it is going to create context. I mean to say, IOC container will be created here. Create context object, create context, then refresh context, create context, refresh context, print total time taken to start the application, print time taken, print time taken to process the application. After this, context started. After the context started, it is printing what is the time it has taken to start this application. Then after this, call runners, call runners. Then finally, return IOC reference. So this is the logic which is available inside our run method. This is the logic is available inside run method, creating the context object, refreshing this context object, printing the time taken to start this application, call runners. It's not runner, it is runners. Multiple runners can be available. Call the runners and return IOC reference. Now, all these activities will done by a run method. So if you don't call the run method in the start class, then these activities will not happen. Then your application will execute like a normal Java application only. If you don't call the run method, then all these activities will not happen. Your application will execute like a normal Java application only. So now, is it mandatory to call the run method or is it optional to call the run method? Is it mandatory to call the run method or is it optional to call the run method? This is mandatory. It is mandatory to call the run method. Run method is doing so many activities internally. If you don't call the run method, all these activities will not happen. Your application will execute like a normal Java application. Your application will execute like a normal Java application if you don't call the run method. Now, can you see what is happening inside the run method? Here, if you go inside the run method, you can see the logic. You can see the logic, right? You can see the logic. Now, first, if you observe system.nano time, what is the application start time? When this run method got started, it is noting down that time. System.nano time, start time. Then creating bootstrap context. So what is the meaning of creating bootstrap context? It is loading initializer classes which are used to initialize our application. The predefined classes it is going to load. Predefined classes it is going to load. Creating bootstrap context. It is creating the bootstrap context. That means it is preparing the memory. It is preparing the context to start the initializers. Once the bootstrap context is created, it will start the initializers. Once initializers are started, it is going to run the listeners. Listeners are going to listen to the action and perform that. Listeners are going to listen to the events and perform the action. The listeners will be started. Initializers will be started. Listeners will be started. Once it is done, it is going to prepare the environment. That means what is the configuration that we have done? It is going to load that configuration and it will prepare the environment to run our application. It is going to prepare the environment and it is going to run our application. Once the environment is prepared, it is going to print banner. Banner means the logo that you see here on the console. This is called as a banner. Spring logo is printing on the console. That banner printing is also part of run method. See here, creating bootstrap context, start the initializers, start the listeners, prepare the environment, print the banner. These logics are available inside run method. Once that banner got printed, it is going to create application context. That means IOC container it is creating. IOC container it is creating. If your application is a normal application, then it is going to use annotation config application context to create the IOC container. Now, in the Spring framework, programmer is responsible to start the IOC container, whereas in the Spring Boot, run method is responsible to start the IOC container. If you develop a project by using normal Spring framework, then programmer is responsible to create the IOC container, whereas in the Spring Boot, IOC is creating by run method. For that, we have a logic create application context. This application context creation also depends upon the starters which are available in the pom.xml. If you have a normal starter, then it will use one class to create the IOC. That is, if you have a normal starter, then it is using annotation config application context to create the IOC. For example, Spring Boot starter web, I am adding web starter. For example, I'm adding web starter in my project. Okay, now right click, run as boot application. See the behavior when we add a web starter. See the behavior when we add a web starter. Can you see? Yes, for web starter, this is using this class. For web starter, IOC using this class to start. I mean, the run method is using this class to start IOC. When we have a web starter, it is using this class to start the IOC container. This is the class which is used to create the IOC container. How I got this class? Run method is returning reference of the IOC, right? I am getting the bean object from that return type. Run method is returning configurable application context. I am getting name of that bean, which bean it is used to create the IOC. Context.getClass.get name. So I am getting the reference of IOC. With that IOC reference, I am printing the bean name. So now in my pom.xml, I am having a web starter. When I have a web starter, it is using this class. It is using this class to start the IOC container. Annotation config servlet web server application context. This is used internally to start the IOC container. For example, if I don't use web starter, if I use a normal starter, run this application, run as boot application, it is using annotation config application context to start the IOC container. For boot starter, run method using this class to start IOC container. Okay, based on the dependency, the configuration is getting changed. If you use a boot starter, normal boot starter, boot web starter, if you use a normal starter, it is using annotation config application context to start the IOC. If you use web starter, run method is using this class to start the IOC. For example, if we use a starter called WebFlux, Spring Boot starter, WebFlux starter I am going to use, which is for reactive programming. When I use WebFlux starter, see here, which class it is going to use to start the IOC container, which class it is going to use to start the IOC, run as boot application. See the class name, which is using by the Spring Boot, which is using by the run method to start the IOC container. So depends upon starters in the pom.xml, it is starting the IOC container. Programmer is not responsible to start the IOC container in the Spring Boot. IOC container will be started as part of run method. See here, reactive web server, annotation config reactive web server application context. It is using another class to start the IOC. Okay, for Webflux starter, run method using this class to start IOC. Interviewer may ask you how IOC container will start in Spring Boot. How IOC container will start in Spring Boot. Programmer responsible to start the IOC. Programmer is not responsible to start the IOC. Programmer is not responsible to start the IOC. When we run the boot application, in boot application console, we can see Spring logo that is called as banner. In boot application console, we can see Spring logo that is called as banner. And IOC container is also starting as part of run method. How this IOC container is getting started? The IOC container starting based on starter we add in the pom.xml. If you add just a boot starter to develop a normal application, we are going to use boot starter. When we use boot starter, it is using this class annotation config application context to start the IOC container. When our application is having boot web starter, boot starter web, for boot starter web, run method using for boot starter, for normal boot starter, run method using annotation config application context class to start the IOC. For boot starter web, run method is using annotation config servlet web server application context to start the IOC container. For Webflux starter, for starter Webflux, run method using annotation config reactive web server application context to start the IOC. So you understand how IOC will be created as part of run method. Programmer is not responsible to create the IOC. Boot will take care of IOC creation based on dependency we have added in the pom.xml. Boot starter is used to create standalone applications. Boot starter is used to create standalone applications. Boot starter web is used to create web applications using Spring Boot. Boot starter web is dependency is used to develop web applications. Boot starter Webflux. Starter Webflux is used to develop the applications with reactive programming. Starter Webflux is used to Webflux dependency. Webflux dependency is used to develop applications with reactive programming. Reactive programming nothing but event-based programming. We can develop event-based programming by using this Webflux starter. Are you guys clear with my point? Right. Now, so here in this application class, it is taking start time of the application. It is creating the bootstrap context. Initializer classes will be loaded, listeners will be loaded, then environment will be prepared, then banner will be printed, then application context will be created, refresh the context, then take the end time, printer, how much time it has taken to start the application. It is printing that time also, how much time it took to print that application, the time also it is going to print. Then call the runners. Guys, call the runners nothing but in your application, if you have a requirement to execute some logic only one time when the project is started, then you can go for runners. Okay, runners in the Spring Boot. Runners are getting called at the end of the run method. Runners in the Spring Boot. What is the purpose of these runners? Runners are getting executed. Runners are getting called at the end of run method. Runners are getting called at the end of run method. Got it? Runners are getting called at the end of run method. Runners will execute the logic. To execute any logic only one time at the end of run method, then we can go for runners. If we want to execute any logic only once, when our application got started, runners are getting called at the end of the run method. If we want to execute any logic only once when our application got started, then we can use runners concept. For example, use cases. Send an email once application got started. Send one email to management. Send email to management once application started. Okay. Second one, read data from DB tables and store into cache memory. This activity we will do only one time. Send email to management team once application started. I want to do that activity only one time. Read the data from the DB tables and store into cache memory. Once my application got started, I want to read the data from the database table and I want to store into cache memory so that my application can take the data from the cache instead of interacting with the database every time. So to improve performance of the application, we are going to use cache memory. So to load the data into cache, we will write the logic. That logic should execute only one time. Any logic that you want to execute only one time, that you can keep inside the runners. Runners are getting called at the end of run method. If we want to execute any logic only once when our application got started, then we can use runners concept. In Spring Boot, we have two types of runners. In Spring Boot, we have two types of runners. One is called as application runner and the second one is command line runner. One is called as application runner, second one is command line runner. Both runners are functional interfaces. They have only one abstract method. That is run method. There is only one abstract method, that is run method inside the runners. We can write the logic inside the, if we want to create a runner, we need to implement those interfaces and we need to write the method for that. Runners are getting called at the end of run method. If we want to execute any logic only once when application got started, then we can use runners concept. In Spring Boot, we have two types of runners. One is application runner, second one is command line runner. Both runners are functional interfaces. Functional interface means the interface which contains only one abstract method is called as functional interface. So what are the use cases to go for the runners? I want to send one email once my application got started. I can write that logic by using a runner. I want to read the data from the database table. I want to store into cache memory. So for this also we can go for runners concept. What is banner? Whenever we execute Spring Boot application, the banner is getting printed. Banner in Spring Boot. When we run the boot application, a banner, a Spring logo is printing on the console. In boot application console, we can see Spring logo that is called as banner in Spring Boot. We can customize banner text. We can customize banner text by creating banner.txt file under src main resources. We can keep our company name or project name as banner text in ASCII format. Banner is having three modes. Spring Boot banner having below three modes, guys. One is console mode, which is a default. Second one is log mode. Third one is off mode. Okay, Spring Boot banner is having three modes: console mode, log mode available, off mode available. We can customize the banner text also by creating one file called banner.txt file under the resources folder. Generally, people will keep their project name as a banner name, or they will keep their company name as a banner name. Suppose if you don't want to print that banner, then you can stop that banner also by using modes of the banner. For the banner, we have three modes. One is called console mode. Second one is log mode. Third one is off mode. Console, it is default mode. That means if you don't set the mode also, by default, it is going to take as a console mode. That means the banner text will be printed on console of the application. Log mode, when you have a log file, the banner text will be printed on the log file. Off mode, if we set the mode as a off, banner will not be printed. If we set banner mode as off, then banner will not be printed. Banner will not be printed. Are you guys getting my point? How to set the banner mode as a off? See here, currently when I run my application, it is printing banner. So here I have a normal starter. Run this application, run as boot application. See the console. Is the banner printed? Yes, the banner is printed. Now let me go to this resources. Let me create one file called new file. I want to customize the banner. I'm creating a file with a name called banner.txt. Now let me generate some ASCII code for this. Let me generate the ASCII code. ASCII text generator. Go here. I'm going to give AhokIT as a banner text. Now it is generated. Copy this. Keep in the banner.txt. I generated a ASCII text here. Earlier Spring is printing. Now I have generated ASCII text for AhokIT. That AhokIT text I kept inside banner.txt file. Now refresh our application. Run it. Run as boot application. Now can you see AhokIT printing as a banner text? Like this, we can customize the banner text. We can keep our company name as a banner text. We can keep our project name as a banner text. Okay, so how we are customizing that banner? How we are customizing? First of all, what is the banner in the Spring Boot? Who is printing that banner? Banner printing is part of run method. If you see, banner is printing as part of our run method. Now in boot application console, we can see Spring logo that is called as banner in the Spring Boot. We can customize banner text by creating banner.txt file under src main resources folder. We can keep our company name or project name as a banner text in ASCII format. Here I am using this URL to generate that ASCII text. Generate the ASCII text from here. generate ASCII text from here. We can generate the ASCII text from here. So now for this banner, we have modes concept, guys. Go here. In this YML file or in the properties file, we can configure mode of the banner. Spring dot main dot banner mode is equal to off. Spring dot main dot banner mode is equal to off. The default mode of the banner is a console. Now I am setting the mode as off. Off means the banner will not be printed. 1 second. Let me update this project. Maven, update the project. I'm setting the banner mode as off. Spring.main.banner mode is equal to off. Run as boot application. Now can you see, is the banner is printing or banner is not printing? Can you see the banner is printing, the banner is not printing? Banner is not printing. Why the banner is not printing? Why the banner is not printing? We are setting the mode as off. So how to set the banner mode as a off? In the YML file, you can set like this. In the properties file, you can set like this. Spring.main.banner.mode. Spring.main.banner mode is equal to off. Spring.main.banner mode is equal to off. Main.banner mode is equal to off. So this is the property that we are using to set the banner mode. Good. So what is this run method, guys? So run method is very important method. A lot of logic is available inside the run method. This run method is executing bootstrapping logic. The run method is executing bootstrapping logic. So now when we create the boot application, start class is created by default. It is the entry point for boot application execution. When we run the boot application, it is executing from here only. Now in this, we have a main method. Inside the main method, we are calling run method. Inside the run method, lot of code is available. This is the overview how the run method is getting executed internally. Creating a bootstrap context. That means some predefined initializer classes will be available. It is going to load the initializer classes. Then listeners. So whenever application started, if web starter available, start the IOC container. If webflux available, support for the reactive programming. Okay, if normal starter available, use application context to start the IOC container, annotation config application context. So some listeners are required. Based on the events, they should perform the action. Those listeners will be loaded and will be started as part of run method. Then prepare the environment. That means what are the properties we have configured in the properties file or in the YML file. It is going to load those properties and it is going to prepare environment to execute our application. So bootstrap context, starting the listeners, initializers, listeners, preparing the environment, then print the banner. We have seen what is banner. Once all these steps are completed, then it is going to create application context. It is very important. IOC container is getting created as part of run method. How the IOC container creating in the Spring Boot? In the Spring Boot, it is using multiple classes to start the IOC container. Depends on dependencies available in the pom.xml. If you create a normal Spring Boot application, then then boot starter will be available. If the pom.xml is having a boot starter, then it is using this class name or it is using this class to start IOC. Annotation config application context class is used to start the IOC container when we have normal boot starter dependency. Suppose our application is having web starter. When the application is having a web starter, it is using annotation config servlet web server up. Even that class names are difficult to read, that be lengthy. It is using a lengthy name to start a lengthy class name is available. That class is used web server servlet. You can see servlet is there. That is means it is used for web starter. Annotation config servlet web server application context to start the IOC container. So here, if you see starter web flux. Here it is using reactive class to start the IOC container. When we will go for web starter, if you want to develop a normal boot application, then you will go for web starter. If you want to develop a web application by using Spring Boot, then we will go for boot starter web dependency. When we go for web flux, that means we want to develop a application by using reactive programming. Reactive programming means a new concept that introduced in the Spring 5.x version. So I want to execute my program based on some events. Then we will go for that reactive programming. We'll go for reactive programming. So like this, IOC container starting. Once this IOC container started, it is going to refresh the context. That means performing the dependency injections. So creating the objects for the Spring Beans available in the application, and creating the objects for the classes, refreshing the context, dependency injections it is going to perform. Then finally it is going to print how much time to complete all this process. To complete all this process, how much time it has taken. It is going to print that total time. It is going to print total time from here to here. How much time it has taken to complete the execution, that a total time it is going to print. Then finally, last stage, it is going to call runners. Runners are used to execute any logic for only one time when the project is started. Runners are getting called at the end of run method. Runners are getting called at the end of run method. If we want to execute any logic only once when our application got started, then we can use runners concept. We can use runners concept. Any logic you want to execute only once, like I want to read the data from the database table, a static table is available. If I read the table 1000 times also, data is not going to change. It is a static table. So when we have a static table, why to hit the DB every time to get the static table data? Why we need to hit the DB every time to get the static table data? Why can't we get the data only one time from the DB, store into cache memory? That logic can be implemented by using runners. Now see here, how can we implement a runner concept? New class. I'm going to take here as a cache manager. Cache manager. This class is going to implement a runner called application runner. This class is going to implement a runner called application runner. As we told, these runners are functional interfaces. Now application runner, here we have a run method that we need to override. I'm overriding run method. Inside this run method, I'm writing a logic to load data to cache. Logic executing to load the data to cache. Now I want to represent this as a Spring Bean by using component annotation. I'm representing this class as a Spring Bean. I'm just creating one class called cache manager. That cache manager implementing application runner. That means I am representing this class as a application runner class, so that this class will be executed as part of run method. I no need to call this method. I no need to create the object for this class. I no need to call this method because this class is already represented as application runner. So Spring Boot is going to execute this class as part of run method. This is called runner. Runners are getting called at the end of run method. If we want to execute any logic only once when application got started, then we can use runners concept. In the boot, we have two types of runners: application runner, command line runner. Both are functional interfaces. Only one abstract method, that is called run method. Now right click, run as boot app. See the console. Can you see logic is executed? Can you see the logic got executed? Logic executing to load the data to the cache. That means my runner is executed or my runner is not executed. Guys, tell me, look at the console and tell me, my runner class is executed or my runner class is not executed. my runner class got executed, right? Am I calling the method or IOC is executing that runner? Am I calling that method or IOC is executing that? IOC is executing. Where is the logic to execute the runner? Where is that logic available to execute the runner class? Come on. Inside the run method. Inside the run method, the logic is available to call the runner. Now, here I have created one runner called application runner. I have created one runner called application runner. We can create one more runner also, that is command line runner. This is a cache manager, and I'm going to create one more runner, send app start mail. App start mail. When the application started, I want to send one email. So this I can implement by using command line runner. There is another runner available, command line runner. So to represent this class, this runner class as a Spring component annotation, I'm using to represent the class as a Spring Bean. To represent the class as a Spring Bean, we are using component annotation. Now here, logic executing to send email. Application started. I want to send a notification when my application started, or I want to execute some logic. I want to execute some logic when the application got started. Then I'm going to use these runners. So here I have two runners. One is a cache manager. Another one is send app start mail runner. Cache manager is a application runner. App start mail is a command line runner, right? Two runners I have. Refresh, run as boot application. See this? Oh, both runners got executed. Both runners got executed or not? Both runners got executed. Which one is executed first? Application runner executed or command line runner executed? Application runner will be executed first. You see, in this run method, logic, call the runners available. This is the logic available in the application Spring application class, predefined class, to call the runners. It is loading all the runners. First, it is loading all the runners. It is creating one collection, array list. It is creating a collection called array list. In the project, it is loading all the classes which are belongs to application runner, adding to the collection. Then it is loading all the command line runners which are belongs to command line runners, adding to the collection. Then it is sorting that by using comparator, sort the runners. Once it is sorted, then it is going to call the runners in a loop. It is checking if the runner belongs to application runner, then call this runner. If it is belongs to command line runner, then call this runner. Right, guys? Call the runner method. It is used to call the application runner. It is used to call the command line runner. Can you see the difference in executing command line runner and application runner? This method is used to execute application runner. It is a predefined code. It is used to execute application runner. It is used to execute command line runner. Can you see any difference? Can you see any difference in these two methods? If you can understand the difference in these two methods, then you can understand what is the difference between application runner and command line runner. Observe this code. Here we have a logic. Here we have a method, call runners. Call runners. It is calling, it is loading all the runners, adding to a collection. The runners are executing in a loop. If the runner, it is checking instance of to check the type of the object. If the runner is belongs to application runner, call this method. If the runner is belongs to command line runner, call this method. Application runner, run method it is calling. Command line runner, run method it is calling. So what is the difference in calling the command line runner and application runner? Can you see the difference? Arguments are different. Whatever the arguments we are giving to the application, those arguments are supplied as a object to the application runner run method. What is the run method parameter? Application arguments object is coming as a parameter. For command line runner, are we getting the object as a parameter or we are getting the arguments as a array? For command line runner, only source arguments are getting passed as a array. Whereas for the application runner, complete application argument is passing as a object. That is the difference. That is the difference. Application runner run method is taking application arguments object as a parameter, whereas command line runner is taking only source arguments as a array. That is the difference between application runner and command line runner. This is for application runner and this is for command line runner. Here we are using component class. What is the meaning of component class? Component class is used to represent this class as a string bean. At the rate component annotation is used to represent our Java class as string bean. Generally, we will configure the class as a string bean in the bean definition, bean XML, right? Here, do we have any XML file to represent our classes as a string bean? Do we have any XML file to represent our class as a string bean? We don't have any XML file to represent our class as a string bean. We don't have any XML file to represent our class as a string bean. So to represent the class as a string bean, we are using one annotation called component. Component annotation is used to represent our Java class as a string bean. So I hope you understood run method internals, including banner and runner. Guys, are you able to understand? Sir, initializers means these are predefined classes. If you go to Maven dependencies, there is one file called auto configure jar file. If you go to auto configure jar file, at the end there is a meta inf. There is a file called spring.factories file. Can you see what are the listeners available? What are the initializers available? So these are some predefined classes for auto configuration purposes. Some predefined classes, some listeners, some filters are required. Those are already configured in the spring.factories file. The spring.factories file you can find out in the meta inf folder. This meta inf folder is available in the auto configure jar file. The main advantage of the Spring Boot is auto configuration. So if you go to your boot application Maven dependencies folder, if you expand this folder, you can see all the jars which are loaded, which are used in the class path. There is a jar called auto configure jar. If you expand that jar file, you can see one folder called meta inf. Inside the meta inf, there is a file called spring.factories. If you open this file, you can see what are the initializers available, what are the listeners available, what are the post processors available, what are the filters available in this file. All these things are getting loaded. These are some predefined classes. Spring Boot is managing our configurations, right? That means Spring Boot is having some classes. Those classes are getting loaded as part of our run method. Okay. Got it, guys? Refresh context means preparing the IOC container. IOC container created. Refreshing the context means making that context ready to use, man. Just refreshing means making that context is ready to use to perform the dependency injection. That's it. Right. Run here, creating bootstrap context, running the listeners. They are available in the spring.factories file, preparing the environment. preparing the environment. Now, application arguments for the runners, arguments are getting supplied, right? Those arguments are our command line arguments that we are supplying. So here for the main method, we are passing the command line argument. The command line arguments we are passing as a parameter to run method. Run method passing those arguments as a parameter to our runners. Whatever the command line arguments that we are passing, those arguments are supplied to the runner. Any input that you want to give to your main method, you will give as a command line argument now. Those arguments are supplied to our runners. Prepare context, refresh context. Refresh context means a shutdown hook register application context. So refresh this context refresh. That means whatever the beans which are loaded, it is going to refresh or load all the beans and perform the dependency injections, right? Then printing the total time it has taken, then calling the runners. Runners are executing at the end. To execute any logic only one time, our runners are getting executed. Once the runners got executed, finally IOC container context object is returned by run method. So you see, I am taking Spring application.run method. This run method is giving the return type as configurable application context. This is the reference of the IOC container. So which class it used to start the IOC? I am printing that IOC name also, context.getClass.getName. And one more thing, system.out.println context.getBeans. How many beans it is loaded? Get beans, get bean name. You can get the beans which are loaded by our application. Context dot get bean method is available. Get startup date, get bean provider, get bean name, get environment, get parent. Like that, there are several methods are available as part of this. By using those methods, we can get the information from our IOC. Earlier, there was a method earlier to get the total beans loaded by the Spring Boot. I think they have removed that method now. Count. Yeah, get bean definition count. Yes, it is available, sir, not removed. Get bean definition count. Get bean definition count. Beans loaded. That means how many beans loaded by our application. How many beans loaded by our application? How many beans loaded by this IOC container I'm printing? Run this application. Run as boot application. Can you see the console total? How many beans it loaded? Guys, how many beans it loaded? 42. How many classes we have created? Only 2 runners, na? Only 2 classes are our user dependent classes. But what about remaining 40? What about remaining 40 classes? From where the 40 classes it loaded? Those are called initializers and listeners. Those are called initializers and listeners which loaded by the Spring Boot. Why it is loading that initializers and listeners? What is the benefit of loading the initializers and listeners? To provide you auto configuration. To provide you auto configuration, Spring Boot having some classes internally. Using those classes, it is providing the auto configuration concept for you. Yes, now look at this. Internals of run method. We have done the postmortem and the run method. What is run method? How it is getting executed internally? What is happening inside the run method? We understood those details. I hope you are clear. I hope you are clear. Sir, I'm feeling very great because I'm understanding internals. Huh? Thank you, man. So once you understand the internals, then you will get the confidence on that subject. Now, if anybody asks you how Spring Boot is executing internally, if anybody asks you how Spring Boot is executing internally, if you draw this diagram and if you explain, definitely people will get surprised. Definitely people will get surprised because we are not just understanding. We are going inside that code which is available, and we are seeing that what is the internal code, what are the internals, how boot is executing. Simple. If somebody asks a question, what is the banner in the Spring Boot? Banner is just logo, right? But we know all the details about the banner, how the banner is printing, from where the banner is printing, how to customize the banner text, how many modes available, how to set the mode for a banner, what is the default. If you can explain all these details for the banner, that means you are very good in the boot. You know the internals of the boot. If somebody asks a question, how the IOC container starting in the Spring Boot, most of the people will tell that IOC container creation is internal part in the Spring Boot. We no need to create that. It will be creating that. But how it is creating? Which class it is using to create the IOC? We know that create context method is there. If the boot starter is there in the dependency, I mean in the pom.xml, it will use this class to create the IOC. If there is a web starter, it will use this class to create the IOC. If it is a webflux starter, it will use this class to start the IOC. When to use boot starter to create standalone applications, when to use web starter to create web applications, when to use webflux to create the applications with reactive programming. Reactive programming is the new concept in the Spring, introduced in the Spring 5.x version. What are the runners? Runners are used to execute the logic only one time when the boot application got started. So Spring Boot supports for two types of runners. One is application runner, another one is a command line runner. Right? Both are functional interfaces only. They have one abstract method called run method. Use cases. I want to load the data from the DB2 cache only one time when my application started. Right? Then we will go for this. I want to send an email once my application started, then go for runner. So to create the application runner and command line runner, we can create the classes like this. So to represent these classes as a Spring Bean, we are going to use component annotation. Component annotation is making our class as a Spring Bean. So these all are the internals of the run method. Okay, guys, I hope you got the clarity how boot application is executing. What is the return type of the run method? IOC container reference. Can we get the name of the class which used to create the IOC? Get bean. I mean bean dot, that is context dot get class dot get name. This is the reference of the IOC. Context dot get class dot get name. By using this, we can create our we can get the name of the class which is used to start the IOC container. Based on the dependencies, the class is getting changed to start the IOC container. So here I have given the notes also for that. Based on the dependency you added in the pom.xml, it is changing the class name to create the IOC container. So if you want to get the name of the class which is used to start the IOC container, context.getClass.getName, we are going to get this. If you want to see how many classes loaded by your application, your IOC container, get bean definition count. By using bean definition count, we can get that data. By using bean definition count, we can get that data. Clear? Now, for example, if I don't call this run method, if I don't call the run method, I will execute my project, run as boot application. I'm not calling the run method. What will happen? Will it execute like a boot application, or it will execute like a normal Java application? Normal Java application. So if you don't call the run method, then you are going to miss all these benefits. It is not going to create the context. It is not going to start the listener. It is not going to start the initializer. Environment will not be prepared. Banner will not be prepared. IOC will not be created. Runners will not be called. Nothing will happen. Your program will execute like a normal Java program. There is no benefit of Spring Boot. There is no benefit of Spring Boot. So now tell me, will anybody remove this line of code in the boot application? Will anybody remove this run method call? Will in any project, will you remove this run method call? No, it is mandatory. It is mandatory. Whenever you call the run method, then only this logic will execute. Then only you will get the benefits of the Spring Boot. then only your application will be executed as a Spring Boot application. If you remove this run method, there is no use of going for Spring Boot. It is like a normal Java application. Okay, we should not comment this run method, guys. Run method is the mandatory method that we need to call in the boot start class. It is called as bootstrapping method. What is the meaning of a bootstrapping method? It is preparing the environment, or it is loading the components and starting the application. Whatever is required to start the boot application, all that logic is available inside the run method. It is a mandatory method to execute. It is a mandatory method to execute. Okay, fine. So with this, we are clear with this main method part, and we need to understand this annotation now. We need to understand this annotation. What is that annotation, guys? Spring Boot application. This is also a mandatory annotation that we need to write in the boot start class. Can we remove this annotation? Can we remove this annotation, or we have to keep that annotation? It's mandatory. To run our boot application for the start class, this application, this Spring Boot application annotation is mandatory, and calling this run method is also mandatory. We understood what is the run method. We understood what is the run method, right? Now, let's do the postmortem for this annotation. If you do the postmortem, then you will understand the internals, then it will increase your confidence. You will get the subject. You will get more clarity on the subject. You will become expert. Okay, now always you need to understand the internals of the program. Then only you will understand what is happening actually. So many people will tell you run method will do so many things. Okay, we no need to understand because it is internal part, but we are not leaving that. We are going inside that method. We are checking each and every line of code, what it is doing and why it is doing. Everything we have to understand. We are understanding that. So tomorrow, if anybody asks you what is the start class in the Spring Boot, you should be able to explain at least for 15 to 20 minutes what is the start class in the Spring Boot, what it is doing internally, why it is doing internally. Definitely, I'm hoping that our students will tell about the start class for minimum 15 minutes. What is the start class in the Spring Boot? Come on, guys. Are you in the position to explain for 15 minutes? What is start class? Yes, good. Good. Next one, we need to understand what is this annotation and what is the purpose of this annotation, how it is working internally, that we have to understand. This Spring Boot application annotation is equal to below 3 annotations. One is boot configuration, second one is enable auto configuration, third one is component scan. Now, in the tomorrow session, I'm going to explain you about that annotation. Now I don't have time, so it is not sufficient to start with 10 minutes, guys. So I need another 1 hour time to explain this annotation internals. So in the tomorrow session, we are going to do the postmortem on this annotation. So tomorrow we'll understand what is the component scan, what is this auto configuration, what is this boot configuration, some stereotype annotations like a component, service, repository, configuration, bean, all those annotations we are going to discuss in the tomorrow session. Okay. Good. Guys, please join the class at 6:45. From today onwards, our class is getting started at the 6:45 a.m. So today I have seen some people joined after 7 o'clock. If you join after 7 o'clock, you will miss some content. So please be available at 6:45. So if you're unable to wake up at 6:45, keep an alarm, keep a reminder and wake up and get ready to attend the class at 6:45. So from today also it started at 6:45. So tomorrow also class will start at the 6:45 a.m. Okay, thank you.